Today, we're going to be looking at something that maybe some of you have not ever thought about, and that is actually the concept of mental disorder. It is very easy to take for granted what we perceive to be mental disorders as universal, and that really is not the case. In fact, those of you who've taken very many psychology courses realize that the DSM changes, and we're up to the 5th version of it now. And there have been changes all the way along just within this one context in terms of what is and what is not a mental disorder. There are different schools of thought. There are different value systems that are attached to these concepts. So I'd like to start going over those right now. And first, I would like to bring up the complete notes that hopefully you can see. And if you want to use the partial outline notes and fill in, that's fine. If you just want to follow along, whatever is convenient for you. It is good for me. Anyway, this very beginning question, does mental illness exist? Well, first we have to ask ourselves, what are the mental processes that we're actually looking at? First, thought, the idea of thought processes, cognition, being able to take in things and perceive them and translate them into some kind of meaning. Memory. We can think of a lot of disorders in which it seems like a lot of things are intact, but the ability to form, let's say, new memories is no longer there. And emotion. And sometimes this gets missed because we consider emotion to be something a little bit different, and it's just from a different system, and it's just how we're feeling at the moment. But there are abnormal emotional responses or states that can occur. So we're also looking at that. And I mentioned at the very outset of this that there are cultural values that exist, and they can differ in very many different cultures around the world and even within one area of the world. And they have an influence on whether behavior, thought, emotional expression, and so on are actually disordered or not. There are lots of historical descriptions that have existed in the English-speaking world, and they weren't always treated as medical problems. And on the other side, in some cases, they weren't perceived as being medical problems. On the other hand, sometimes people were stigmatized for them. And that is something we will talk about more at length as we move on through this lecture. In non-Western cultures, there are many cases of behavior that psychiatry itself, the way we practice it, would classify as mentally disordered. However, these very same behaviors, thought processes, emotional expressions are not seen as signs of mental illness in the culture of that particular individual. So other cultures may not have a concept of mental illness that corresponds to the Western concept. So back to our original question, does mental illness even exist? So let's take a look at some of the current views of mental illness. And these are going to be very different from one another. And bear with me as we go through these, because it's important that we kind of take a stand and see mental illness from this perspective in each case. There is the extreme view that was put forth by Thomas Szasz. You will have readings available to take a look at his concepts more in depth, if you wish. Now, Szasz purported that there is no such thing as mental illness in any culture at all. And he completely criticized the scientific methodology of psychiatry and criticized the conceptual basis of mental illness. He actually said, quote, "The belief in mental illness rests on a serious, albeit simple error," unquote. And he says it confuses what is real, what is reality, with imitation. I could spend a whole probably 45 minutes just talking about that. It's a very philosophical way of looking at it, that what is real and what is simply imitation of what somebody sees or what the expectations are. We don't have time for that in this particular class. So we're going to move on to the next thing that our Thomas Szasz purports, and that is, he states that by definition, disease or disorder, if you will, and right now I'm using those interchangeably, means a bodily disease, and that the mind is not literally part of the body, and that mental disorder is simply an evaluation label. And that label concept is an important one that we will be talking about throughout the semester. And it justifies the use of medical power to intervene in behaviors that are disapproved of socially. That is a really, really important concept. In other words, if the particular society in which this behavior is seen disapproves of that behavior, then according to Szasz, it's just going to be a label, and so that society can control that individual's behavior. An important point is that stigmatizing does not mean that a condition does not exist. And this is basically a counter against Szasz. I mean, he was very worried about, or I shouldn't probably say worried, but he saw stigmatization as a reason not to admit that something existed or not to acknowledge the existence of something. But if you think about it, if there is stigmatization in some of the papers, HIV is used against something, and we don't have the stigmatization now that we had only a decade or two ago. But the issue is, just because something is stigmatized doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. He also had the idea of the lesion concept of disorder. I should go back to that for a minute. And that is that unless there is a lesion, meaning an area where there is something missing, something that is like a sore, something that is like more or less physically observable, that is the only way a disorder can exist. Szasz does not have widespread credence anymore. For a while when he came out, people, look at it and start thinking about it. And there are support for aspects of Szasz's view, but they're not as extreme. And it leads to more debate over particular mental illnesses than the whole category of a mental illness. And if you want to think about it for a moment, examples are things such as depression. I'm talking clinical depression that is debilitating. Psychosis that can exist in something like schizophrenia, or even in severe cases of depression and in drug use and so on. Now, instead of looking at the whole category, let's say depression as a whole, there starts to be a little bit more emphasis on which aspects are actually disordered. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about Saz's view, and as you can see, we've pretty much moved away from that in this civilization at least. So the relativist view still says that it's not an absolute transcultural fact. The reality, again, you hear that word reality come up, of mental illness is not an absolute transcultural fact. And that statements about the existence of mental disorders or illness or disease, again, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page with that, can be true in some cultures and false in other cultures. And that kind of goes back to what is perceived as not only acceptable, but some cultures view specific behaviors, even though they are not the norm, to be indicative of a special higher level of spiritual understanding. Another interesting point. Then we have the mainstream view in the West. And we have increased our knowledge dramatically over the past few decades. And there has been increasingly sophisticated concepts that have evolved throughout this time. And those have all resulted in changes in our description and thus our treatment of mental illness or disorder. And the one thing that I want to make sure before we go on to this question that I pulled up for you is that this mainstream view in the West acknowledges that mental illness does exist. And honestly, we don't have to look back very far in our history to see where that was not a concrete belief or a concrete value, if you will, because we are going to be considering value systems as we move on in this civilization for a very long time. So the question, verbatim, posed by Kendall in 1986, when this was really becoming investigated and philosophically examined, is the most fundamental issue, and also the most contentious one, is whether disease and illness are normative concepts, stay with me, based on value judgments, or whether they are value-free scientific terms. In other words, are they biomedical terms or socio-political ones? This is a huge question, and it is fundamental to a lot of our understanding as we proceed. One thing you're going to see in this class is, because of its name, Neurobiology and Mental Disorders, we will be looking at concrete physical changes, alterations, differences that can account for certain aspects of a variety of mental disorders. But then again, we're going to need to consider, do these changes make a difference or not? So, the concepts of disorder, more specifically, and again, hang with me here because there are important things within this lecture that I think we all need to think about as we move from here. One concept, it's a pure value concept, and it applies to both physical and mental disorders. So there are actually judgments of desirability according to the social norms and ideals. And this particular pure value concept leaves absolutely no room for scientific content. And it allows for the unconstrained use for purposes of social control. Remember, I mentioned that above as we were kind of introducing these concepts. Next, all sickness is essentially deviancy from something which is considered more desirable. In other words, and again, you'll see Sedgwick in 1982 suggested that it's really a gap between whatever behavior is being presented by the individual or a feeling, emotion, expression by that individual and some social norm. So we definitely have this value system in place. Okay, hopefully you've thought about this as we were talking. But next is the idea you should ask the question, are all undesirable conditions disorders? Undesirable disorder. If you think about different conditions, and if we want to be completely physical, take a house. And it may have some undesirable aspects to it, but it's not a disordered house. So take that same idea and apply it to a human being. I know it's a stretch, I know it's a big jump, but I'm just trying to point out what we're talking about in terms of undesirable conditions and disorders. And in this pure value concept, there is no part, there's nothing that actually addresses a breakdown in the functioning of an internal mechanism. So we're going to move to the second concept, disorder as whatever professionals treat. In this case, the person himself feels for himself and or his social environment and perceives something to be disordered. However, many concerns that are handled by health professionals are not really disorders, but they're assigned to health professionals because of their special skills. Just think of it. Childbirth is a normal childbirth, is not a disorder. And it is still assigned in most cases to a professional. There are other things, circumcisions, marital conflicts. Let's talk about that for a minute. We're getting into more of an interpersonal situation. Those are assigned to a marriage counselor, professional, and yet, is it truly a disorder? Just a few little examples that kind of span quite a variety of behaviors or situations. The third concept of what disorder is statistical deviance. 1981, Sir Henry Cohen put out a paper and purported that disease is quantitative deviation from normal. You all know from research methods and statistics how you have the 3 deviations, from the mean. So kind of be thinking along those lines. But if we're only talking about deviance or deviation from the norm, and we're looking at deviations on both sides. We're starting in the middle and moving this way and moving that way. Excellence, extremely high IQ, things like that are quantitatively deviant from the norm. But is that a disorder? And is being slower in terms of reaction time? Okay, here you are. This is a norm for reaction time. This person is actually faster than norm, and this person is slower than the norm. But is that a disorder? So this is really a rather simplistic concept of a mental disorder. And many negative conditions, what we would consider negative conditions, are statistically normal in a specific context. Now, disorder is often statistically deviant. And that is a concept to keep in mind as we go through and learn about the various disorders we're going to discuss this semester. However, here's a question. Should a dysfunction be judged on the basis of the design of an internal mechanism or internal mechanisms rather than the statistical norm? And if you go, here's another thought. If you move from one population to another, even within the same country, and especially within the same civilization, you are going to see different norms. So then, what do you hold to the standard? Okay, those were the first three concepts of what mental disorder is. Number 4, disorder as biological disadvantage. This is based on evolutionary theory, okay? And this next point is taken from a paper by Barr in 1991. You could see we're moving from the 1980s into the 1990s. And I want you to really think about how recent in medical history that is. But this biological disadvantage disorder theory accepts descriptions of normal mental and behavioral mechanisms as legitimate biological descriptions, hang with me, of the advantageous mechanisms that were naturally selected. Why do you exhibit this particular behavior? Because it helps you survive. You have two people who exhibited this correct supposed behavior, and they produce offspring. Hypothetically, the offspring will have a higher chance of showing these same evolutionarily successful behaviors. Therefore, according to this concept, disorder is basically lowered survival or reproductive fitness. When some mental mechanism, can be perception or the fear response, just as a couple examples, does not perform the specific function it was designed by evolution to perform. And the interesting thing about this particular concept is we start combining of this lowered survival or reproductive fitness with a value component. So the question becomes, when does this lowered survival or reproductive fitness or so forth cause a person real harm? And if you think about disadvantage, is that a value term or not? Now, I want to bring up one behavior, for example, or one mental mechanism that we will be discussing frequently later on, and that is the fear response. Anxiety, which is the sense of fear without the something there, the actual presence of something of which you should be afraid, okay? And we'll be doing a lot more with that. And if somebody, back when I did research with rats, I didn't work with that, but I went to a lot of conferences in which people presented different lines of research. And I'll never forget this one poster. This individual basically lesioned a part of a mouse brain, and then put the mouse around a cat and said this mouse showed absolutely no fear of the cat anymore. And he tried to connect the fact that this one area was lesioned with the absence of fear. I'm not going to go into the legitimacy of his research, but that leads me to, if a mouse needs to survive out in the wild, there are certain other species of which that mouse should be afraid and run away from. So I'm just trying to tie that little concept back to here. The problems with this also include things like there can be a condition that reduces survival or reproductive fitness, but it doesn't really cause harm to that individual. Think about fertility. There are very, very many different situations in which fertility is reduced in both the male and the female, and yet the individual doesn't suffer. So can we call that a disorder? So let's move that to the idea of the concepts of mental disorders. So next, we have disorder as harmful dysfunction. And I want to stop just for a moment because we've been going through a lot of these. And I want to take a minute for you to get your breath, because the next section, we're really getting into the meat of what we believe now, okay? Before we move on, I hope that you're putting together some of these ideas about whether mental disorder is strictly something that we judge based on our own value system, whether it is strictly something that's detrimental to you surviving, or whether it's a combination of both. So let's go back and bring back our screen again, and we're going to move on to Wakefield. Jerome Wakefield actually, in my opinion, did a pretty good job of pulling together aspects of these other concepts into something that makes a little bit more sense. And so disorder as harmful dysfunction. Think about it, harmful. We're saying that there is something about this behavior or situation in which it's going to be difficult for that individual. But dysfunction indicates facts. And he says both are involved in the concept of disorder. And for Wakefield, a dysfunction exists only when an organ cannot perform a relevant natural function. And disorder, basically, according to this particular conceptual framework, lies in the boundary between the natural world and the constructed social world, that world in which we operate, we move as human beings. So disorder is simultaneously biological and social. Mental disorder is harmful when it's value based on social norms, sorry about that, and is a dysfunction when the failure of a mental mechanism to perform a natural function for which it was designed by evolution infringes on a person's well-being, as defined, back up to the harmful part, by social values and meanings. So these two concepts, the idea of social norms, values, and the fact of something being dysfunctional in and of itself, are really closely interwoven. Let's take a look at the medical model real quickly. In the medical model, we basically have this very clear-cut concept that whether a particular condition is normal or abnormal is completely up to science in the scientific or medical world. And I apologize, there's my name up there. Don't know how I did that. We'll live with it for now. Anyway, medicine, including psychiatry, the medical model purports, should be absolutely value neutral. And then we end up with the mixed models. And mixed models, there's a variety of them, but these mixed models do include Wakefield's harmful dysfunction model. So, two aspects of the classification, okay? We're kind of connecting the idea of diagnosis. If you diagnose somebody with something, there is a classification involved. So what conditions get classified as mental illnesses rather than normal conditions? This question leads to controversial diagnoses. And we are going through that all the time. It is definitely ever changing. And we will continue to see that, I believe, for some time to come. So how are conditions actually grouped? If we're talking about, right now, remember, mental disorders, mental conditions, mental disease. Will we be able to classify mental illnesses according to their causes, like the rest of medicine, according to some people, although I kind of disagree with that to a little point. I don't think it's exactly that clear cut. Or do our current diagnostic categories really match up? Since we classify most mental illnesses according to symptoms rather than causes. And I'd like to note that part of that might be because up until the advent of these incredible imaging techniques that we now have, take Fundamentals of Human Neuropsychology in the spring if you have not done it already, and we spend a lot of time on imaging. Well, we learn about imaging and then utilize that in terms of different neural problems. So think about it. We are talking about symptoms, and that's kind of how we're classifying different disorders rather than the actual causes. Very, very important concepts. Now, this lecture is very different from what is to come. I'm going to be doing another small lecture, hopefully on the first Zoom meeting that we have. If I have not done that already, it will be coming. And so I just want you to realize, like, the very beginning of this is we need to think about what we're talking about when we talk about mental disorder, mental disease. And we can't take for granted that everybody is thinking the same way as we do. So that is like the first little section of this lecture. And then we're going to be moving on to another section in which we have to learn about the neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, how do neurons communicate, and the neurotransmitters that are used for this incredibly diverse method of communication. And this will take some time. But since this is neurobiology of mental disorders, it is absolutely essential that we all have the same level of knowledge and understanding regarding these aspects of mental capacities, mental illnesses versus this particular mental processes is what we would expect. And so after we move through that section, we will finally move to the various disorders that I have time to cover in this class, and what it is that is different in either the neuroanatomy or the neurophysiology and chemical communication in individuals who demonstrate symptoms that we interpret to be a disorder. So don't give up if you're like, oh man, this sounds way too much like philosophy. We have to actually consider a little bit of that before we go into the neurobiology aspect of the course. And I hope that maybe it actually triggered some questions of your own. So until next time, take care.